Among self-managed Kubernetes platforms, there are three major players: OpenShift, Rancher, and VMware Tanzu. If you're going to self-manage your Kubernetes clusters and you want a platform that ties it all together, you're likely going to choose one of those three. Today we are going to explore Tanzu. I already went through and created a video about Rancher, so you can watch that. The link is somewhere in the description. I did not yet have time to go through OpenShift, at least not within a video. I mean, yes, in real practice. Anyways, today is all about Tanzu. We are going to explore the Community Edition, right? I will not go into the differences between Community Edition or open source and commercial or enterprise version. I will not show you what enterprise can do. We are going for free today, so Community Edition it is. There are a few things you should know about Tanzu in advance. To begin with, it is based on Cluster API, which is awesome, potentially awesome. I'm not sure yet. In any case, if you're not familiar with Cluster API, there is a video for that as well. The link is in the description. It creates a management cluster that enables us to spin up all the other clusters that we might need. And finally, applications are managed through something called Carvel, which is a set of tools that do quite a few things. It is kind of a replacement for Helm and GitOps and YAML and a few other things. But today we're not exploring Carvel. If you would like me to explore Carvel, I can do that as well. I will put it on my to-do list. For now, we are focusing only on Tanzu. So let's get going. Let's see what we'll get. To create clusters with Tanzu, we need Tanzu itself, and Tanzu runs only within a Kubernetes cluster, so we'll need to set it up. We'll need to create a management cluster, and we can do that easily with Docker by executing command Tanzu management cluster and then create. And if you would like to operate it through a UI, web UI, then --UI. And that almost instantly opens a page where we can choose between running the management cluster in Docker, in VMware vSphere, on Amazon, or Microsoft Azure. Now you will notice that Google Cloud is conspicuously missing over here, but hey, nobody's perfect, right? Nobody uses Google Cloud. Just kidding. I use Google Cloud and this makes me very, very sad. But hey, I'll switch to AWS today. Why not? Now we need to fill in quite a few pieces of information. To begin with, I need to add the credentials to my AWS account, go through VPCs, and then choose the settings for the management cluster. It can be in the development mode or production mode. The major difference between the two is in the number of control plane nodes. Development gives you one control plane node. That's not highly available, so don't use that in production unless you really want to save money. And production gives us HA with 3 control plane nodes. But since this is a demo, I will go with development right now. There is no difference really except in the number of nodes. So I will fill in all the fields over here as well. Go through metadata and Kubernetes network. And in identity management, I will disable it because again, this is a demo. And in real world situation, you should probably keep it enabled. And I will choose the OS image that depend on the provider. In this case, it's Amazon, so 2 images available. And then I will click next and review the configuration. Now, one of the things I really like about Tanzu is that it allows us to do things from CLI or web UI equally, right? I could copy and paste this command and create the management cluster from my terminal, from a CLI. I will not do that today, even though I prefer CLI simply because I'm already in the web UI, so I can just as well click the button and see what happens next. And now it is deploying Tanzu, which means it is creating all the resources in AWS, and then it will connect all those servers together, install Kubernetes, do everything that needs to be done, or hopefully everything that needs to be done. And we can see the progress from the web UI, or I can switch back to the terminal and see the progress there. The information is more or less the same, so choose whichever one you prefer. Now this takes approximately 20 minutes more or less. It's faster than if you created EKS, because there is less work to do, or more, I'm not sure. Anyways, 20 minutes, give or take, is what it takes to create a cluster in AWS. Now that cluster is not a cluster you should use for your applications. It is not a workload cluster. That's just the management cluster. That's where Tanzu is running. And from there on, we can use it to create additional clusters. Now, if you would like to get information about the management cluster that was created, we can execute Tanzu management cluster get, and that gives us the list of all the management clusters. I have only one. In most of the cases, one is all you need, unless you need more for reasons like multi-tenancy, permissions, and so on and so forth. Next, I will export mgmt name variable with the name of my management cluster. I know what's the management cluster, but you might not know what is the name because you might have forgotten, and then, hey, put it into a variable. You can see it from the output. And by the way, now that I'm talking what I'm doing, I just remembered, I forgot to tell you that there is a gist with all the commands, and the link to the gist is in the description. So if you want to reproduce what I'm doing, well, you can. Now here's what happened. We created a temporary management cluster in Docker to solve chicken and egg problem, because Tanzu needs to run somehow, somewhere. And then once it started running as a container in Docker, we used it to create a permanent management cluster, in this case in AWS. And once that happened, Tanzu itself shut down the container that was used just to provision that initial management cluster. And now, if I list all the containers with docker container ls-a, we can see that there are no containers running. So it removed all the garbage that I do not need locally anymore, because my management cluster is running in AWS. And since I will need to be able to access that management cluster, I will execute Tanzu management cluster kubeconfig. I want to get it. Here's the name, and I'm going to export it into kubeconfig-management.yaml, and I want to be the admin of that cluster because I feel empowered. And to finish with the access, I'm going to export kubeconfig as well with the path to the file that was just generated. And I'm going to validate whether my cluster is really up and running by executing kubectl get nodes. And we can see that there are two nodes, one for the control plane, another one for the workload, which is Tanzu alone. Actually, Tanzu is a collection of applications, but Tanzu package, let's say, suite. And if you're curious what you got, you might want to start by listing all the namespaces with kubectl get namespaces. And we can see that there is copy or cluster API, there is Tanzu itself, and there is TKG, which is Tanzu management packaging system, not management, packaging system, which we are going to see briefly in a moment. And now we are ready to create a first workload cluster, right? So far we just managed to run Tanzu itself, but now we can see what it really does. Now you might be thinking that Tanzu will give you a web UI to create and manage additional clusters, workload clusters, but that's not the case. That might be the case in the Enterprise edition of Tanzu, but not in Community edition. So the only way we can create additional clusters is by using Cluster API directly, and the easiest way to do that is to copy a config that was created already for the management cluster and then modify it slightly so that we get something that resembles workload cluster. And since all the files are stored in config tanzu tkg cluster configs, I can list the contents of that directory. We can see that I have there one file that is not called management, even though that's how I called my cluster, but that's where the information about the management cluster is stored. So I'm going to store that name, the name of the file, into a variable mgmt config, and then I'm going to copy that config into the same directory but with a different name. I'm going to call it app cluster, and I'm going to edit that file because there are a few things I need to change. I will make minimal changes, even though for real production I should probably put more effort into it. But what I really need to change is the name of the cluster, the new cluster, the one that I want to create. So I will change the cluster name variable in that file into app cluster. And I will keep everything the same, right? You should explore that file yourself. I will keep it as is and just execute Tanzu cluster create. The name of the cluster is app cluster, and the file that contains all the configuration of the cluster is in app cluster YAML. And that will take some time, probably 20 minutes, 30 minutes. So what can we do in the meantime? Yes, let's take a look at what Tanzu created in my AWS account. Now you might expect that since I'm using AWS, the Tanzu would create and manage my EKS clusters, but as you can see, that's not the case. The list of my clusters, EKS clusters, is empty. So Tanzu is not helping you manage managed Kubernetes clusters. Instead, it does the old-fashioned, let me create servers and then install Kubernetes on top of those servers, as if AWS is the same as on-prem, which might be used in the same way, but that's not necessarily what majority of people do. So this is a bit disappointing. If I would be using Rancher instead of Tanzu, Rancher now, since a while ago, not a long time ago, but since a while ago, allows us to manage Kubernetes clusters. But in case of Tanzu, no, you get on-prem running in AWS type of situation. And I can confirm that by going to EC2 and then listing all the EC2 instances. And you can see that in this account, I have only 2 servers, 2 EC2 instances, 1 control plane and 1 worker node of the management cluster, because the new cluster that I'm creating right now with cluster API, Tanzu, etc., is still not up and running, did not yet reach the part of creating servers. The main reason why I'm showing you AWS is to make it clear that you cannot create EKS, GKE, AKS, and other types of managed clusters. You can create servers and then install Kubernetes on top of those servers and everything that Kubernetes needs and so on and so forth. So you get a really good Kubernetes platform, probably good. We are yet to get to that point, but you're not getting managed Kubernetes. Think about it before you choose whether to use Tanzu or no. Now let me go back to my terminal and wait patiently for some 20-30 minutes. I will not wait. Let's fast forward to the end of this process. One of the ways we can see what's going on is by listing all the clusters with Tanzu, by executing Tanzu cluster list, and over there we can see only one cluster and it's already running. So it took actually less than 20-30 minutes that I said it would take. This was relatively fast, faster than EKS. Now this is a bit confusing. You would think that you would get the list of all the clusters, but that's all the clusters minus or without the management cluster. If you want to include the management cluster into that output, you would need to execute Tanzu cluster list and then include management cluster. Now, since this is using cluster API behind the scenes, you do not need to use Tanzu CLI. You can do everything with kubectl as long as it is pointing to the management cluster, and you can say something like kubectl get clusters and get the same output. I mean, not the same output, but the same list of the clusters that are managed right now from inside of the management cluster. Now that raises a question, hey, if we are using cluster API to manage workload clusters, then why isn't Tanzu using cluster API to manage the management cluster? And the answer is probably related to historical reasons, like, hey, why are you using Docker instead of some local Kubernetes clusters to do what you need to do, and so on and so forth. Now let me try to access that cluster, and to do that I need to get kubeconfig of the second cluster of the APP cluster, and I can do that just as before with Tanzu cluster kubeconfig and then get the name of the cluster where you want to export it and whether I should be admin. Then I export kubeconfig with the path to that file and execute, wait for it, kubectl get nodes. And there are the nodes of the new APP cluster or the second cluster, the cluster that is not management cluster, and so on and so forth. And now comes the fun part. Let's install something inside that APP cluster, and we can use Tanzu package management or whatever it's called just for that. Now, I could install everything I need using Helm or Customize or something like that, but since this is Tanzu, and Tanzu likes its own package management that comes from Carvel and so on and so forth, I will use Tanzu just for that. And the first thing I need to do is to add a repository. So I will execute Tanzu package repository and I will add something called tc repo, and the URL is whatever the URL is. And I want to run the package manager in the namespace Tanzu package repo global. Don't ask me why, that's what the documentation suggests. And to be on the safe side, I can list all the package repositories with Tanzu package repository list, specify the namespace, which is blah, blah, blah. And then I get all the repositories, which is only one, because that's how many repositories with packages I added. And if you want to know what is available in that package repository, well, you can do that easily by listing all the packages with the command Tanzu package available list. That available word sounds a bit silly, right? Would anybody like to list unavailable packages? Admin maybe? I don't know. And we can see a modest number of packages. Disappointing number of packages actually. But the good news is that the packages in this repository are most of what you might need to manage your Kubernetes cluster or to run that Kubernetes cluster. We have app toolkit, cartographer, cert injections with cert manager itself, contour, external DNS, Fluent Bit Gatekeeper, OPA Gatekeeper, Grafana, Harbor, Knative, Kpack, local path storage, I mean, you don't need that much. Multi-CNI, which I don't know what it is, Prometheus, Valero, and Whereabouts, which again, I do not know what that is either. So here's what's going on. The cluster that we got with Tanzu is not really ready to be used. We would need to install a bunch of packages to make it a real cluster, a useful cluster. This is bare bones cluster right now. So let's install one of the packages. What should I start with? Let's say Grafana. Let me start with Grafana and I can see which versions of Grafana are available by executing Tanzu package available list and then the name of the package, which is Grafana, etc, etc, etc. And then I get a list of two versions, two releases of Grafana available, 7.5.11, 7.5.7. Now, this does not sound right. My memory does not serve me as it did in the past, but those two versions seem to be very, very old. Remember, right now when I'm recording, it is April 2022. And this looks like it's a year old. Actually, if I look at the date, yes, it is a year old. It is from May 2021. So, Tanzu Community did not update Grafana, and Grafana is very, very popular. So if there is anything that they should be keeping up to date, that's probably Grafana, and it is moving at fast pace. So let me go to Grafana releases and see what is the latest one over there. And yes, I was right. The latest stable version of Grafana is 8.4.5, made in March 2022, almost a year since the last release of Grafana was put into Tanzu's package repository. That's very, very disappointing. It's as if nobody cares about it. And if nobody cares about Tanzu Package Manager, which is Carvel by the way, then why would I use it as a user? Why would I care about something that even maintainers do not care about? But I'm going to talk briefly about package management later when we get into pros and cons, because by that time I might get a bit less disappointed than I am right now. Who knows? And just to be on a safe side, because sometimes I make mistakes and I want to double check that I did not mess up something, I'm going to go to Tanzu's Git repository and double check whether that's indeed the latest version of Grafana that they have over there. And yeah, it wasn't my fault. It's very, very, very old. Nevertheless, let me install it and see what we'll get. I mean, a year-old Grafana is better than no Grafana at all, so I'm going to execute Tanzu package install, Grafana, and then the name of the package and the version, which is 7.5.11. And then a couple of moments later, there we go, it failed. And it failed because this specific version of Grafana requires Contour, which is networking solution that is packaged into, it's not actually packaged, the package is in the repository and it is commonly installed with Tanzu. And this is kind of silly because if Contour is a requirement for Grafana, then package manager, Tanzu package manager should understand that dependency and probably install Contour or something like that. That's what Helm would do, right? If I added a dependency to something, then that dependency would be installed as well if it's not already up and running in a cluster. So I'm still very, very disappointed. Now let's talk about dashboards. Can I use a dashboard? Can I have a dashboard that I can use to manage my clusters and to manage applications, the workloads in those clusters? And the answer to that question is no, or partially yes. There is no web UI that is easy to find and logical and documented and so on and so forth that we can use to manage the clusters themselves we need to do that from a terminal or using GitOps. By the way, Cluster API is very, very friendly to GitOps, so that's a good option. That's the option I would choose, but I imagine that many people using Tanzu like web UIs, so there is no web UI for managing clusters. There is only web UI to manage the management cluster, but once you manage and create and have a management cluster, then you cannot use that same web UI to manage the rest of the clusters, which is strange, disappointing, unless you pay some money and go to enterprise version, which probably has that, but that's not the subject of this video. But for the workloads, Tanzu recommends Octant. Now, we don't have to use Octant. We could use Lens, for example, which is absolutely awesome if you want a graphical user interface to manage your cluster, or to be more precise, workloads in your cluster or clusters in plural. But since Octant is part of VMware and somehow part of Tanzu, even though it's not a requirement for Tanzu, I will use that because, hey, it's part of the package, and I can easily start Octant by executing Octant and then take a look at what we'll get. Now, I will not go through Octant for two reasons. First, because I already did that in a separate video. If you haven't seen it, go and check it out. The link is somewhere in the description. And the second reason why I will not go through Octant is because it is not really part of Tanzu. It is an add-on that works equally well or equally badly, depending on how you look at it, in any Kubernetes cluster, not only those managed by Tanzu. Now, there is only one more thing I want to go through before going into pros and cons, my favorite part of every video. I want to see how easy or hard it is to upgrade clusters with VMware Tanzu. Now remember, this is Cluster API. This is not really specific to Tanzu. Tanzu is more like a collection of open source projects, especially those where VMware heavily contributes, and one of them is Cluster API. And if you want to change any aspect of our cluster, including upgrades, we need to go to the config file and then change something over there. And that's what I'm going to do in Vim, right? Because I like Vim. So what should I do? Yes, I forgot to enable auto scaling. So let me do that. Let me add a parameter, a variable, enable auto scaler, and set it to true, because every cluster should scale automatically, and I forgot to do that when I created the cluster in the first place. And I will set the minimum number of nodes to 2 and the maximum number of nodes to 5. That sounds reasonable for a demo cluster. Now I need to figure out what is the command that I can use to update or upgrade my cluster, and I can probably figure it out through help. So let me execute tanzu cluster --help. Now the curious thing here in the list of the commands that we can do on top of a cluster is that we can do quite a few things. We can create a cluster, we can delete the cluster, we can list clusters, we can scale the cluster, we can upgrade the cluster, but we cannot update the cluster. So I will have to assume that either updating a cluster is not an option, or more likely that the upgrade command is used to change any aspect of the cluster, not only to upgrade Kubernetes version. So let me do just that. Let me execute Tanzu cluster upgrade app cluster. Now it seems that it got confused because it's telling me, hey, do you really want to upgrade to version 1.22.5 or not? I will say yes, even though I'm not upgrading Kubernetes version, I'm just trying to update the cluster. I want to add cluster autoscaler to it. But hey, maybe that's what it should do. I don't know. Let's see what will happen if I say yes. And it finished successfully. Now, whether it did what it's supposed to do or no is yet to be seen. So let me retrieve all the nodes. I have only one worker node. So the cluster autoscaler either was not installed, probably it ignored my config, or it is not working, or it takes a bit of time. So let me repeat the command. Let me retrieve all the nodes again from both the management and the application cluster, just to be on a safe side. Maybe it got confused which cluster to use, and wait for a while. And no. By the way, I was waiting for half an hour just to be 100% sure that it is really not working, or maybe it is working. I'm not showing this in this video, but hey, cluster autoscaler is not working. Now let's talk about Tanzu, let's talk about pros and cons and come to some idea whether you should use it or no and under which circumstances and so on and so forth. But before we do, no, there is no but. Let's go for it. Now, if we go to the official documentation, we can see that Tanzu is massive and it has quite a few layers. It can run in Docker, which is kind of silly, except for the management cluster, in VMware, in AWS, in Azure, and disappointingly not in Google Cloud, which is kind of silly unless they are on bad terms. Maybe that's the case, I don't know. And then we have compute runtime, which is Kubernetes and Cluster API and Carvel. Carvel. And then we have other layers with a bunch of other tools, and some of them are great, some of them are... Anyways, it's a really complete platform that has everything that you might potentially need, except that everything you might potentially need is not installed when you create a cluster. You need to do it manually through their package manager, which is outdated. So it's disappointing. Now, before I proceed, let me give a big shout out to VMware for creating or contributing to projects like Cartographer, Knative, Velero, Carvel, and so on and so forth. I really, really like the fact that VMware is a very, very heavy contributor to many of the projects that you might or might not be using, independently of whether you're using VMware products in general, whether you're using Tanzu or no. Those are great projects. I mean, Knative, man, it's absolutely amazing. Velero is the de facto standard for backups. Cartographer is Carvel as well, but some are great, some are not so great, but I really, really admire VMware for being a heavy, heavy contributor to many of the projects that I use on a daily basis. But that's not the subject. Even though I give big thanks to VMware doing what they're doing, this is about Tanzu. So let's talk about Tanzu and let's start with cons. To begin with, I think it is silly that it is using Docker to create the temporary management cluster before creating it or moving it into a permanent management cluster. I think it would make much more sense to use any local Kubernetes distribution like Rancher Desktop or Minikube or Kind or K3D or whatever you might be using. Because not only that would make more sense, because hey, local Kubernetes to permanent Kubernetes, then Docker to permanent Kubernetes, but also that might solve a problem that the permanent management cluster is not managed in the same way as the temporary management cluster, and neither of two are managed in the same way as the permanent workload cluster, because one uses Cluster API and the other one doesn't use Cluster API. And the probable reason why it is not using Cluster API for the management cluster is because it is based on Docker instead a local Kubernetes cluster. So the first negative point goes to using Docker instead of local Kubernetes cluster. The second negative point goes for not using Cluster API for the management cluster. The third negative point goes to inability to use managed Kubernetes, like in my case in AWS it would be EKS or AKS in Azure or GK in Google Cloud, and by the way it doesn't support Google Cloud at all. In any case, no option for managed clusters. Tanzu Package Manager is just not there. It might be a good idea, it might not be a good idea, but there is no good reason, there is no valid argument to use Tanzu Package Manager instead of, let's say, Helm. Tanzu might be a bit better or it might be a bit worse, but simply Helm has everything I need, all the packages, and if I use Helm to do the same thing as what I did with Tanzu Package Manager, I would actually have Grafana up and running and it would use the latest version or whichever I want, but not the one from a year ago. Octant as a web UI is not my favorite. For managing workloads in Kubernetes clusters, I prefer Lens or one of the myriad of other tools, say K9S, that's my favorite, but let's say Lens maybe, because that's what most of the other people like. And UIs bring me to another problematic point, and that's that there is no UI for managing clusters, workload clusters. There is UI only for managing the management cluster, and not even for managing the management cluster, but only creating the management cluster, the initial one. And after that, you cannot even manage that one with the UI. Now, I don't like UIs myself, but I imagine, hey, if you have a UI then you should have a UI that manages everything, not only the initial setup of the management cluster. Did I mention GCP? Maybe I did, maybe I didn't. In any case, here it goes again. It does not support Google Cloud. And hey, if you support cloud, there are 3 major vendors. That's AWS, Azure, and Google. And you should support at least those 3 without going into deeper rabbit hole for supporting Alibaba and Linode and what's not. And finally, the last negative thing is about inconsistent user experience. How we manage the management cluster is not the same as how we manage the workload clusters, and those sometimes work, sometimes don't. I can upgrade, but I cannot update the clusters. And by the way, I know that I could have updated the cluster using Cluster API directly, and I did follow the instructions, but hey, it's not consistent. It's sometimes great, sometimes not so great, and sometimes things are missing. Now, not everything is bad. There are positive things about Tanzu. To begin with, the process of moving the temporary management cluster into a permanent location is absolutely awesome. I complained about it. I think it shouldn't be based on Docker. I think it should use Cluster API and so on and so forth. It's not perfect. It's not even necessarily great, but compared to what the competition is doing, it's absolutely amazing. Almost nobody is giving me such a good experience of creating a temporary location and then moving it into a permanent location. Another positive thing is that the packages from the Tanzu package repository are most of what we need. They do not always work, they are sometimes outdated, but the things that are in there are what most people need to have a full platform, with everything you might need to manage Kubernetes clusters. So that repository is absolutely awesome, except that it doesn't always work and it's not always up to date, but that's already in the negative section of this segment. Cluster API is awesome. I think it's really great that Tanzu is basing its strategy not on something that they baked themselves, but on Cluster API. That's absolutely awesome and big thumbs up. And finally, everything is traceable and everything ends up being stored as a file, and we can push that into Git. We can do the things the right way. Even if we click buttons over there, the stuff is stored in the local file system and I can push it to Git. I can use GitOps if I want to, and so on and so forth. Actually, I cannot use GitOps because they're not really Kubernetes manifests. Anyways, I cannot use GitOps, but I can store it in Git at least. And now comes the big question, a huge question. Does it make sense to use Tanzu in cloud or only on on-prem? Given that it doesn't support managed Kubernetes cluster, given that it's clunky and not really giving me benefits when compared to alternatives in cloud, I would say do not use it for cloud, but for on-prem, yes, maybe. I'm not comparing it today with Rancher and OpenShift, so that would be a separate video, but it is a valid candidate to handle your on-prem needs. Not on cloud, not today. And then the second question is what I already mentioned. How does it compare to Rancher, OpenShift, and other similar tools? But not in this video. Let me know in the comments. And if previous questions were big ones, here comes a massive question. A very important thing to understand or to ask is whether it brings any value beyond Cluster API. Most of the things that we saw are based on Cluster API, and I could do exactly the same, more or less better or worse, without using Tanzu. So the question is, if I adopt Cluster API myself directly, do I need Tanzu? What do I get? And the answer is mostly not much. Package manager, which is not so great. The means to create the initial management cluster, that's a good one actually. I like that part. So yes, we get something, but not much. Most of what we're getting is not Tanzu, it's Cluster API. And that leads me to, I'm not sure whether it's a conclusion, but yet another question. Maybe if we're not getting much from Tanzu Community Edition, we should go directly for enterprise version. But most of us are evaluating things first and then moving to enterprise version, and I'm not sure. But I would say that Tanzu is too much focused maybe on not community, even though they are huge contributors. It's a bit of a strange situation where most of the things that we might really need is not in the community version, but in the enterprise version. I'm not sure. I'm on the edge on whether using Tanzu myself. I would need to compare it one more time with Rancher and OpenShift, so let me know if that would be interesting. Thank you so much for watching. See you next time. Cheers.